economy of the country was to use the resources from oil in order to develop agriculture.
On balance, despite these reservations, the benefits of oil were positive. Increased revenues made possible impressive health and education programs. Oil wealth provided for massive spending on the building and expansion of schools and hospitals. There were also ambitious training programs for medical staff in a comprehensive healthcare system. One of the prime objectives of the healthcare program was to train more surgeons and physicians. The aim was to reduce the number of patients per doctor to make access to treatment easier. In the years after independence, the ratio of patients to doctors did fall sharply. So did the number of patients for each available bed. A new medical college was opened at Lagos University. And at Ibadan, University College Hospital became one of Africa's most prestigious medical schools. These were just some of the facilities expanded to train more doctors and nurses throughout Nigeria. Along with these improvements, Nigeria started a comprehensive program to eradicate smallpox, the first of its kind in Africa. Health workers could now bring treatment to all parts of the country. Mobile clinics regularly visited remote villages in every region. Along with health, education played an important role in newly independent Nigeria. At first, policy was handled mainly by local or regional authorities, but after independence, the federal government increased its role in setting priorities. Enrollment in primary schools rose, but there was still an acute shortage of space. Children were taught in 2 shifts to make the most of rented buildings. Some buildings were quite unsuitable for use as schools. So over £3 million was set aside for building new schools and adding extensions to existing ones. Enrollment into secondary schools grew particularly fast, especially for vocational training. It wasn't just that the number of pupils increased in the years after independence. More emphasis was also placed on teacher training colleges to meet the growing demand for highly trained teachers. And enrollment into universities was to see a dramatic change compared with 1960. It shot up as the secondary school graduates entered higher education. A new generation of Nigerian professionals was emerging. Despite this social and economic progress, by the middle of the decade, regional conflict was rising. Politicians sought to play a greater role in federal issues. They whipped up tensions among their supporters. The NPC, the dominant party in the north, was led by the Sadona of Sokoto. The party was a partner in the ruling coalition, and the Prime Minister Tafawa Balewa was also one of its leading members. The NCNC was headed by President Azikiwe. His party governed the East and the Midwest. It was also part of the ruling coalition. Akintola had by now formed his own grouping. He called it the Nigerian National Democratic Party. These parties, plus the Action Group, were to contest the 1964 elections. But the campaign was to see a reshuffling of party alignments to maximize the chances of winning power. On the one side, the NCNC and the Action Group combined for a joint election campaign. They formed the United Progressive Grand Alliance. They were fighting the NPC and Akintola's NNDP, which together formed the Nigerian National Alliance. As a result of these marriages of convenience, the election was now between these two groupings. The desire to win had produced two national coalitions that spanned the regions. As the campaigns closed, there were fears the elections wouldn't be conducted fairly. Political leaders held a crisis meeting on election eve to discuss how to make absolutely sure it would be free and fair. The United Progressive Grand Alliance, the UPGA, was not convinced and called for a boycott of the polls. This affected voting, particularly in the West. The overwhelming victors were the Nigerian National Alliance, grouping the NPC and its allies.
The 1964 elections was, I think, the first election after our election for independence. We were on our own. Regionalism has been established in the minds of all the leaders. Nobody wanted to be ruled. Everybody wanted to rule.
Human nature being what it is, you see, some people love power. Some people just want to attain power by hook or crook. It happened in Asia, it happened in America, it happened in the United Kingdom in the early days of this country, for that matter. And it's happening even now in Northern Ireland, in Ireland, for that matter. So I think it's an aspect of human nature that some people just want power for whatever, either for personal reasons or for, well, tribal reasons or regional reasons. But the main thing really is that power should be exercised on a democratic basis.
Because of growing concern at how elections had been conducted, Azikiwe was at first reluctant to call on Balewa to form a new government. He eventually did so, but agreed new elections would be held in regions where voting had been most affected by the call for a boycott, notably the West. It was also decided to hold elections for a new Western Regional Assembly. By the time those elections took place in 1965, feelings were running high. Politicians of all parties were stirring emotions among their supporters. Army units were posted to the west as law and order appeared to have broken down in the campaign. Each side accused the other of vote rigging, intimidation, and bribery. But the federal government didn't intervene, and the election went ahead with a disputed victory by the Nigerian National Alliance. It was significant, however, that the army had intervened. They'd become drawn into the trials and tribulations of a young democracy. It was only a matter of time before they were to feel they had to act. The government appeared to be helpless.
The Nigerian army took part in that election. They were posted to different constituencies to keep order. And they saw what was going on. Because they saw what was going on, they themselves developed an interest. That's what happened. If the army had been insulated from what was going on, it would have been difficult for them to strike.
Politicians had appeared to fail. Because there seemed to be a disregard of the Constitution, the army decided to step in. The coup of January 1966 has to be seen against the apparent impotence of the federal government. A coup had seemed improbable. Defense spending was still small, and the army had only about 10,000 men, mostly inexperienced. The coup was intended as a national effort to remedy a worsening national situation, but it unintentionally gave the impression of being Southern-inspired. Middle-ranking officers were behind the coup. But the army head, General Ironsi, finally assumed control and placed the coup leaders in detention. The Prime Minister Tafawa Balewa was killed in the coup. So was Chief Akintola and the Sardona of Sokoto.
The first time we heard about it was on the radio when some fellow came on the radio
and said more or less that it sacked everyone, the civilian rulers, and that he and his group were taking over. We didn't know who he was. All we knew was that he was a soldier. We liked what he was saying, and we started celebrating. We thought it was high time somebody did something about the rot, we're all falling into. That was our first reaction. Great.
I just didn't believe it could happen. It could happen in Nigeria, and it could happen at that time, and it could happen the way it happened. It was total disbelief.
It came as a relief. It came as a relief.
I must tell you that subjectively, I was very happy with what was happening in the West at the time, demanded some very drastic intervention.
I felt disappointed. I felt disappointed because our program was to have independence without shedding blood.
It's a very one-sided, misguided coup. But nonetheless, we accepted it as the work of God and were prepared to work within the system.
A lot of people were asking me, do you think that there could be a coup in Nigeria? And I remember saying, coup in Nigeria, impossible, such a thing cannot happen. No, we were not trained to take over government or to be involved in government, but to be loyal to the government of the day and that sort of thing.
In just 6 years, why had democracy failed Nigeria? And was this necessarily a disaster?
Democracy is all well and good, but if it wasn't working for the people of this country, then we had no use for it. If somebody else came over and said he had some other idea as to what he thought he could do to change things a bit, we said, jolly good. Come and do what you can. Yes.
Ironsi surrounded himself with a small group of advisors who seemed to bypass the civil service, and the panels established to plan for future administration. Ironsi's government turned to the most pressing task of the day, the question of national unity. But the solutions he offered would only increase antagonisms. He decided to do away with regions altogether and announced plans for unitary government. He declared regional and federal public services would be unified. This strengthened fears that the coup had been intended to establish Southern influence. The initial euphoria of toppling politicians subsided as the North grew increasingly uneasy with the new administration.
What we felt at that time was that it was a kind of unity being imposed on the North. It did not develop naturally. It was imposed. It was a military regime at that time, And this declaration, unification decree, which unified the entire country, most people in the North, including myself, felt that it was a deliberate attempt to impose the leadership of a particular part of the country on all the others.
The fear was fear of domination. In the North, at that period, the South had a big advantage in that they had many more educated people, more experienced people in business, and they controlled the economy as well as the administration of the country at that time. And the North felt that they had to be given the chance to catch up. And the idea of unitary system would not give them that chance.
Northern politicians thought the unitary move would limit the influence of their region. They encouraged resentment against the East, for Easterners were thought to be behind the coup that had brought Ironsi to power. In July 1966, there was a second coup. Ironsi was killed. Some other officers also died. For a while, the country was without leadership, though the military were clearly in control. Finally, the Army Chief of Staff, Lieutenant Colonel Yakubu Gowon, took over as head of state. Gowon, like Ironsi before him, talked of an early return to civilian rule. He immediately restored the old regional structure, and he organized regional meetings to prepare for a constitutional conference. It first met in Lagos in September. This consultative process to tackle the problem of national unity was unprecedented.
Well, General Gawan was left with a very delicate situation in hand. The country was on the verge of breakup, and so he had to try to keep it together. I think one of the reasons for the Constitutional Conference was to iron out differences between and among the regions.
There had been 2 military coups in 6 months. In his own way, each leader had come to grips with the issue of national unity. Ironsi had decided to abolish the regions. Gawan said there should be more states. He may have hoped to diffuse regional tensions by breaking up large areas into smaller units. This would satisfy minorities. It would also ensure that no state by itself would be powerful enough to threaten any other. During the conferences, violence broke out in the north against Southerners. Again, local politicians appeared to stir up hostility towards Southerners associated with the unpopular policies of Ironsi. Thousands of Southerners fled back to their homeland in the east. The Eastern military governor, Ojukwu, ordered all non-Easterners out of his region, saying he could no longer guarantee their safety. He refused to attend any more constitutional discussions in Lagos. A rift had started to appear between the Eastern leader and the federal military government. The East was behaving more and more like a separate state. The start of 1967 brought new hopes of reconciliation after 6 months of crises. Ojukwu and Gawan met in Ghana face to face. But this mood of optimism was short-lived. The eastern region boiled over with demands for secession. In May 1967, Ojukwu declared what he called the Independent Republic of Biafra. Ojukwu must have felt that Biafra could survive because it controlled most of Nigeria's oil resources. The East produced 2/3 of Nigeria's oil. Much of the remainder was piped through the rebel area to tankers at Port Harcourt. Ojukwu stopped payment to the federal government. The government, in turn, imposed financial sanctions on the East. Full-scale hostilities between the rebel state and the federal government broke out in July. The war went badly for the outnumbered rebels. In a few months, they were driven by federal troops from the Midwest state, which they previously occupied. They were also forced out from many areas in the former eastern region, including the capital, Enugu. By March 1968, the oil city Port Harcourt was taken by federal troops. Throughout the war, the Organization of African Unity, to which Nigeria belonged, worked round the clock to help the country maintain its national boundaries. The aim was for Nigeria to resolve its problems with African help and in an African context, rather than risk outside interference. The newly independent African countries felt that secession of rebel states defeated the purpose of independence. National unity became the theme of these meetings. As secessionist forces were finally defeated, a mood of reconciliation set in. People realized the war had been a tragic and wasteful episode in an otherwise progressive country. There was no desire for retribution and no medals for bravery. Many people also felt that they wanted to get on with the task of building a nation. Gawan set about a policy of national reconciliation. He encouraged his countrymen to put behind them the differences that had led to the war.
Well, I'm quite convinced they will soon forget this. Several countries have gone through this sort of problem before. The United States, for example, as a very good example. Do the people of the southern states hold that bitterness still against the rest of the Americans? Certainly not. And I'm quite convinced they will soon, the Igbos here will also forget about it. It all depends on how we handle them and how we treat them after these operations.